Welcome to the 8th week of our lecture series on the right to research and international copyright law. And this week, we're turning our attention to empirical research. We've been discussing mainly doctrinal issues at the intersection of human rights and copyright exceptions for research uses the past 7 weeks. And today we're going to flip gears a little bit and talk to Mike Palmedo, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at PIJIP and an adjunct professor of economics at American University. And his research studies the effects of intellectual property laws on consumers and firms. And some of his research has also looked at the impact of intellectual property rules in trade agreements, including on medicine issues. So today he's going to address some of his recent work, which has been particularly studying the impact of copyright exceptions on research uses. And there's some parallel research that we also assigned in the reading for today, which is discussing the impact of research exceptions, particularly on text and data mining research. Mike, thank you. Welcome.
All right, well, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for having me talk to the class today. As Sean mentioned, this is going to be a somewhat different kind of presentation. I hope that is something that is interesting, not boring. It's going to be an empirical presentation, but this is based on the assigned reading. The paper has been revised. The assigned reading was a version that was published in 2019, and since then, we've gotten data on copyright exceptions from a few more countries, so we have a bigger data set and we have some different control variables as well. So framing the issue, we start with the simple fact that journal articles and books are, and book prices are high. High prices are known to restrict access to knowledge goods, and scholars in the South have documented it. A paper by Albert notes that rising prices have hampered the abilities of libraries, universities, and investigators to acquire publications needed for research. More recently, a survey by Bannerman describes well-documented shortages of journals and books in libraries in the Global South. 2 South Africans did a survey of a bunch of university libraries in South Africa, arguing that prices have become unsustainable and libraries were having trouble accessing books that they needed for their patrons. The next logical jump is that lack of access to existing works is a barrier to the creation of new works. It's been argued by scholars such as Ruth Okadiji that this is the case. There has been a little bit of empirical work to back it up, but not as much as we see in other areas. However, we have papers such as Langer et al. Showing that limited access to published papers was a barrier to further research into diseases prevalent in the South. Adcock and Foxwell say that poor access to current literature in their fields lessened the published output of health researchers from 9 low-income countries. That was based on a survey of scholars in those 9 countries. Alternatively, more recent research on Sci-Hub has shown that when there's a way around high prices, that's associated with more publications, more scholarship coming out of the Global South. To complete the framing of the issue, copyright exceptions govern unauthorized access to copyrighted works. The copyright exceptions differ greatly from one country to another, which is the theme of a lot of the stuff we do at PIJIP, right? Every country has copyright exceptions. Most countries have copyright exceptions that apply in one way or another to researchers and scholars that need to access works in order to build on them and create new ones. But differences exist over who can use copyright exceptions, what works are covered, what purposes are covered. And the bottom line is that copyright exceptions in some laws are way more useful to scholars than copyright exceptions in some others. we build a hypothesis on this. We say that, or I say that scholars in countries where copyright exceptions allow researchers to access works more freely will produce more output. This is something I've seen proposed in legal research, but not really tested empirically with data on publications. And I take it a step further. To the degree that copyright exceptions matter, that they actually allow people to access works that they would otherwise not be able to access, that should matter more in countries where copyright protection is stronger, and it should matter more in less wealthy countries. So to test it, you first need a theoretical framework. Think about it in sort of a Cobb-Douglas production function, where the Cobb-Douglas production function says that production of output is a function of labor and capital. And I take that and I think of labor by scientists writing the paper. I think of physical and financial capital, where you have money for a lab, you have lab equipment, stuff like that, and then access to raw material knowledge goods, which is the information found in published journal articles and books. And this access to this knowledge raw material is affected both by the copyright environment, how strong is protection, how strong are exceptions, and national wealth, just on the idea that countries like the United States will generally, not always, generally have more access to existing works than other places. The first thing to test this empirically you need is a way to measure how strong copyright exceptions are across countries and over time. And to do that, we use data from the PIJIP user rights database. Now, this is a novel survey-based data set that measures changes in a wide variety of copyright exceptions over time in 27 countries. Both the questions and the data from each country is available at the URL on the screen. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the survey. First, I wanted to talk about the countries that are in it. These are the countries. There are 27 countries. I think when the paper that's in the syllabus was published, it might have been 23 or 24, but we've gotten some more in since then. We have 14 high-income countries and 13 middle-income countries. The distinction is important because I expect that there will be a different effect, or I expect that the effect of copyright exceptions will be stronger in the less wealthy countries. Back to the survey itself. So PIJIP's copyright database is based on the survey that has 129 questions grouped into 20 categories based on different types of copyright exceptions. This table shows a list of all the categories of questions. These categories are things like exceptions for quotations or educations or research. The full survey also includes more technical categories like safeguards for secondary liability for internet firms. Now, for each one of these categories, we ask a series of questions about the copyright exceptions for each of these categories. First, we just ask whether the copyright exception was included, or whether a relevant copyright exception for the category was included each year from 1970 to the present. We then ask a series of follow-on questions related to that particular exception. They vary from one category to the next, but they generally include whether the exception applied to unauthorized uses for any type of work, for any purpose, for any type of user, and whether it could be used for commercial purposes. We then asked our respondents to provide legal citations for each answer, and we had our law students check each one. Now, to gauge the level of uncertainty surrounding specific copyright exceptions, respondents answered these questions on a 4-point scale running from clearly not included to clearly included. Each of the answers were coded from 0 to 3, and with the coding, you can observe and measure the strength of each exception in each copyright law. And when each question has coded answers from 0 to 3, we can also create scores for different categories and different subsets of categories for each country each year. On the screen now, we just see the mean score for each of the categories. For this paper, I do not use the whole survey. I create a simple index based on a subset of 12 questions pertaining directly to researchers' access to published scholarly works. These are the questions. They deal with the existence of and qualities of exceptions for research, for education, for libraries, for personal use, and whether or not there's a general exception, any one of which could be helpful to researchers. Now, the question is whether each of these exceptions can be applied to any purpose and whether anyone can use them. They're answered on the 3-point scale that I described on the last slide. And when we average these out, we get an index that kind of looks like this. Most countries are kind of a little bit under a 1 or a 2. Most of them are not way up on either the high end or the low end. It's a more or less normally distributed index, meaning that most values are kind of in the middle, which would make sense for this type of an index. So that was the key independent variable. The next thing you need is some measure of output by scholars. And luckily, there's a lot of data on that sort of thing. So my dependent variable is the number of citable documents published by researchers in a given country, in a given academic field, in a given year. I break it out by field because there's different co-authorship conventions in different fields. I have 2 sources of data. There's the Scopus database and the Clarivate Web of Science. Each of these data sets includes papers and books from many countries, and each has a somewhat different system of categorizing them. So I focus on a subset of comparable subject areas related to the health or the medical sciences. Although the match of subject areas is approximate, I end up with 2 different sources of data on similar subjects. And furthermore, the literature that I reviewed in the paper describes the problem of lack of access to journals, focused a lot in the health sciences. So we have 6 subject areas and from the Scopus database and 8 from the Web of Science database. And here are the descriptive statistics for the number of citable documents from each subject in the data set. Just one thing to look at is that there's a lot of variation. They tend to be skewed, but I'm going to take the logarithm, which deals with that. I test it with this econometric model. It's basically a panel regression. I'll do a series of panel regressions. Here, the output, which is the Y with all those sub S, sub C, sub T. The output is citable new works per capita in subject S, country C, and year T. And on the other side of the equation, we say that this output is a function of the research index that I just described, plus control variables, plus fixed effects for subjects and countries, and fixed effects for time. Well, including all of those fixed effects means it's a panel regression that's controls for variation between countries. The controls I use are GDP per capita to measure national wealth and the share of population that has completed a tertiary education. I believe in the earlier version I had population, it was GDP per capita and population. Population is actually really included within the dependent variable because we're looking at citable new works per capita, or citable new works per person in a country. So I think that the share of the population that's completed tertiary education tells a more coherent story, and you also don't have the same variable on either side of the equal sign. Everything on the right-hand side, both the research index and the controls, are lagged. Now, the reason they're lagged is when the inputs that go into writing a paper, the labor, the capital, the use of existing knowledge goods, that happens before publication, and I use a 2-year lag here. Now, in writing the paper, I really looked for like a authoritative source on how long it takes to write a paper and get it published, and it was surprisingly all over the place, and there's no great peer-reviewed study saying on average it takes 3 years or 1 year or whatever to publish a paper. But it did seem that 2 years was cited by a couple of sources, not academic journals, but other sources, and it fit in with the stories people were telling. The next thing I do is I use interaction terms, which actually makes it all more interesting, I think. So the first interaction term I use is research times strong enforcement. This tests whether copyright exceptions are more important to researchers who reside in countries where copyright enforcement is stronger. It's taken from the enforcement data within the Park Reynolds Copyright Index. This is an index made by Walter Park, who's he's actually better known for his patent index. He's an economics professor here at American University. But he has an index that measures the strength of copyright, which is broken into different subsets. And I take the subset just on enforcement. It's based on whether or not a law has criminal penalties for copyright infringement, whether it has preliminary injunctions to stop infringing activities, whether it calls for the seizure and destruction of infringing goods, and whether it has bans on the circumvention of TPMs. So again, it's different than the full copyright strength index, which I used in an earlier version. I thought that this exercise should really focus on enforcement, because all of the countries in the set have long copyright terms for literary works. So they're all WTO members, and literary works are the type of works that have had copyright protection in place for a long time. So the question really is whether copyright's being enforced, not really the shape of its copyright law. Now, the Park Reynolds Copyright Index is highly correlated with logged GDP. If you have two independent variables on the same side, you run into problems with multicollinearity. So in order to deal with that, what I do is I create a dummy variable equal to 1 for countries with the higher index score. And this is what it looks like. Countries that have a above median enforcement score with the Park Reynolds Enforcement Index, those get a number 1, and other countries get a 0. You'll notice that there's high-income countries and middle-income countries in both groups. However, there are way more high-income countries in the strong enforcement group, which is to be expected. The way it works in an interaction term is if you don't have strong enforcement, the value there's a 0, so the value of research times strong enforcement equals 0, and it's not counted. But if you do have strong enforcement, then there's a 1 times the research score, and it is counted. Now, the other interaction term is countries' income status. The LMIC is a dummy variable equal to 1 for middle-income countries and equal to 0 for high-income countries. This tests whether the hypothesized relationship between copyright exceptions and output is different for less wealthy countries, whether the slope is different. So let's see the results. This is the version before I add in those interaction terms. It's the results of the basic model with the research index and the 2 controls on the right-hand side, plus the fixed effects for subject and country and time. And everything is positive and significant as expected. Now, GDP per capita has a much larger effect than the other 2 variables, which is not a surprise. You expect that as countries get wealthier, you'll see authors in those countries publish more. More people can join academia, people work in universities with fancier libraries, etc. However, the coefficient on research is significant, and it implies that a 1 unit increase in the research variable is associated with approximately a 14 or 10% increase on the number of scholarly publications, depending on whether you're looking at the Scopus dataset or the Web dataset. A full unit is actually pretty large because the scale is between 0 and 3. But another thing to look at here is that the impact is in the same ballpark in both datasets, which is something I wanted to find. If you took 2 different datasets and you came up with wildly different results, then you wouldn't be able to say, it looks like my story held up in both places because there'd be something funny going on in one place or the other. Now we add the interaction terms. When we add the interaction terms, we see that, well, first of all, the controls are still telling the same story, but with the interaction terms, we see that there's a bigger effect in lower and middle income countries. We see there's a bigger effect in countries where copyright exceptions are stronger. And we see there's a positive effect for just research exceptions in countries that are high income and have weaker enforcement, but not much. It's statistically insignificant, actually. Altogether, though, we do see a big effect in countries where, in lower income countries, countries with stronger copyright exceptions. I mean, stronger copyright enforcement. So the conclusion is really just a rehash of of what I told you, and the policy implications are fairly obvious. If countries want to prioritize advancing academic research, they benefit from having more open copyright exceptions that allow more people to access works for scholarly research, and that is where I am going to stop it. Thanks again for having me speak to the class today.